Some people spend their whole lives running from the past, only to realize too late that it was chasing them for a reason. Thomas Greeley was 75, widowed and alone when he returned to the family farm he'd left 50 years ago. He came back to find peace in his final years, to work the land and let old memories fade. The farmhouse still stood, weathered but familiar, and his dog Scout was all the company he needed. But one morning, Scout started digging near the old equipment shed. What the dog uncovered changed everything. Buried beneath rotting timber was a rusted tin box filled with letters his mother had written, but never sent. The words inside revealed a brother he never knew existed, and the real reason his father sent him away. Could these secrets finally heal a lifetime of questions? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires of Thomas Greeley's old Ford pickup as he pulled up to the farmhouse for the first time in 50 years. September had just begun, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown fields that had once been his father's pride. The corn should have been shoulder high by now, ready for harvest. Instead, wild grass and thistle had reclaimed everything, swaying in the breeze like an ocean of forgotten dreams. Thomas sat in the truck for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. The farmhouse stood before him, a two-story structure with white paint peeling in long strips, revealing the grey wood beneath. The porch sagged on one side, and several shutters hung at awkward angles. But it was still standing. That counted for something. Scout whined softly from the passenger seat, a golden retriever mix with a greying muzzle that matched Thomas's own silver hair. The dog had been Margaret's idea 3 years ago, back when she'd still been well enough to take walks around their suburban neighborhood. "You need something to care for," she'd told him, her hand thin and cool in his. "Something that will need you when I'm gone." He hadn't wanted to hear those words then. Now, 2 years after her funeral, Scout was all he had left. "All right, boy," Thomas said, his voice rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another person in 3 days, not since he'd paid for gas at a station 2 counties back. "Let's see what we've got here." The air smelled different than he remembered, less like turned earth and livestock, more like decay and wild things. He walked slowly toward the house, Scout trotting ahead to investigate the overgrown yard. His knees ached, a constant companion these days, along with the stiffness in his lower back that never quite went away. 75 years had a way of making itself known in every joint and muscle. The front door wasn't locked. It probably hadn't been locked in decades. Thomas pushed it open, hinges screaming in protest, and stepped inside. Dust hung thick in the air, illuminated by shafts of afternoon light streaming through the dirty windows. The furniture was still there, his mother's old sofa, now home to mice by the look of it, his father's reading chair in the corner, the wooden coffee table his grandfather had built. Everything sat exactly where he remembered it, frozen in time, waiting. Thomas moved through the rooms slowly, each step stirring up more dust. The kitchen still had his mother's blue-checkered curtains, faded now to almost white. The cast-iron stove stood cold and rust-spotted. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms waited in silence. His old room at the end of the hall still had the same narrow bed, the same water-stained ceiling he used to study on sleepless nights. In the living room, he found something that stopped him cold. On the fireplace mantel, beneath a thick layer of dust, sat a framed photograph. Thomas lifted it carefully, wiping the glass with his sleeve. The black-and-white image showed a family, a man and woman standing behind a young boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old. His father looked stern even then, jaw set, eyes hard. His mother wore a careful smile, but Thomas could see the tension around her eyes, the way her hand gripped the boy's shoulder just a little too tightly. And there he was, young Thomas, gap-toothed and squinting against the sun, unaware of everything that would come later. The photograph must have been taken around 1952. He studied his mother's face, seeing things he hadn't understood as a child. The sadness there, the weight she carried. Margaret used to say he had his mother's eyes. Gentle, she called them. You see the world softly, Margaret would tell him. Like you're always looking for the good in things. But he hadn't been very good at that, had he? Not with their own children. Thomas set the photograph back on the mantel and lowered himself into his father's old chair. It groaned under his weight, but held. Scout padded over and rested his head on Thomas's knee. He thought about Peter and Grace, his son and daughter, both in their 40s now, both living their own lives in cities far away. They'd come to Margaret's funeral, of course, stood beside him at the grave, spoken the appropriate words. But there had been a distance there, a formality that cut deeper than the grief. When had that happened? When had his own children become strangers? He knew the answer, even if he didn't like it. It had been gradual, a slow pulling away that started when they were teenagers, and he was too busy working, too focused on providing. Then they'd gone to college, built their own lives, and he'd let them go without much of a fight. Margaret had maintained the connections, phone calls, visits, grandchildren's birthdays. She'd been the bridge. Without her, the bridge had collapsed. Peter had called once after the funeral, a brief conversation about selling the house, about whether Thomas had thought about next steps. Grace had sent a card on his birthday with a generic message and no return address. That was the sum of their relationship now. Thomas had tried to reach out a few times in those first months after Margaret died. He'd call and leave messages that went unreturned or catch them at bad times when they were busy, distracted. Eventually, he stopped trying. What was the point? They had their lives. He was just a reminder of obligations, of duty, of a past they'd moved beyond. So he'd decided to come here, to the farm, to the one place that still carried his name, even if it carried nothing else. His father had left the property to him when he died, back in 1973. Thomas had been 23, newly married, working construction in the city. He'd sold off the equipment and livestock through an estate agent, kept the land and buildings out of some vague sense of duty, and never looked back. For 50 years he'd paid the property taxes and ignored everything else. Let it fall apart. Let it disappear. Now, at 75, it was the only place he could think to go. The plan, such as it was simple. He'd fix what could be fixed, tend the land in some small way, live out whatever time remained in the place where he'd begun. Maybe find some measure of peace before the end. He wasn't sick, not exactly. Just old, just tired. Just done with the world that had moved on without him. As evening fell, Thomas unloaded his truck, 3 boxes of clothes and personal items, some tools, bags of dog food, and groceries. Not much to show for 75 years of living. He made a bed upstairs in his old room using sheets he'd brought from home. The mattress was shot, but he'd brought a sleeping pad that would have to do until he could get something better. Scout explored the house thoroughly, sniffing every corner, occasionally looking back at Thomas as if to ask, "Are we really staying here?" "We really are," Thomas told him. That first night he sat on the front porch with a can of soup heated on a camping stove, watching the sun sink below the tree line. The sky turned amber, then deep purple, then black. Stars emerged, more than he'd seen in decades. The city had its lights, its noise, its constant motion. Here there was only silence and the sound of crickets singing in the tall grass. Scout settled beside him with a contented sigh. "Just you and me now, boy," Thomas said quietly. In the distance, he could see the dark shape of the old equipment shed, its roof partially collapsed, leaning precariously to one side. Tomorrow he'd start looking at what needed immediate attention. The porch, definitely. Maybe some of the fence posts, small projects, manageable tasks to fill the days. He had no idea that in less than a week, Scout would lead him to that shed. No idea that beneath its rotting timbers lay a box of letters that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his family, about his past, about the very foundations of who he was. For now, he simply sat in the darkness, an old man returned home, seeking nothing more than a quiet place to fade away. The farmhouse settled around him, with creaks and groans, and somewhere in the night, an owl called out, a question that had no answer. Thomas had fallen into a rhythm by the third morning. Wake at dawn, feed Scout, make coffee on the camping stove, then walk the property while the air was still cool. His knees protested the uneven ground, but the movement felt good. Purposeful. He'd spent too many months sitting in Margaret's empty house, staring at walls, waiting for nothing. The farm was smaller than he remembered. Funny how childhood could expand a place in memory, make 20 acres feel like a kingdom. He'd walked the fence line yesterday, noting where posts had rotted through and wire sagged into the weeds. The barn was beyond saving, its roof completely gone, walls leaning inward like a drunk trying to stay upright. But the chicken coop was still intact, and he thought maybe he could repair it, get a few hens, something living besides himself and Scout. This morning, Scout had different ideas about their walk. The dog kept pulling toward the collapsed equipment shed at the far edge of the yard, a structure Thomas had been avoiding. It had partially caved in years ago, probably decades, and looked ready to finish the job at any moment. Rusted farm implements poked through the wreckage like bones through torn skin, an old plough, parts of a hay baler, lengths of chain. "Not that way," Thomas told Scout, tugging the leash toward the garden plot his mother had once maintained. Scout pulled harder, whining. "What's got into you?" The dog looked back at him with urgent brown eyes, then resumed pulling toward the shed. Thomas sighed and followed. Scout was usually calm, obedient. If something had caught his attention, might as well check it out. Probably a raccoon den or rabbit burrow. As they approached the shed, Scout's excitement intensified. He barked once, sharp and insistent, then began digging at the base of the collapsed wall where timber met earth. Dirt flew between his legs, scattering across Thomas's boots. "Hey, easy now," Thomas said, but Scout ignored him, digging with focused determination. Thomas knelt down, joints popping, and peered at where Scout was excavating. At first he saw only dirt and rotted wood. Then something else caught the morning light. Metal, rusted orange-brown, but definitely metal. "What have you found?" He pulled Scout back gently and began clearing debris with his hands. Old boards came away easily, soft with decay. The metal object was buried about 2 feet down, revealed gradually as Thomas scooped away soil. It was rectangular, a box of some kind. His heart beat faster, though he couldn't say why. Probably just old tools, farm equipment. Nothing important. But something about the way it was buried, deliberately, carefully, made him wonder. It took 20 minutes to excavate it fully. A tin box, roughly the size of a large shoebox, sealed with a rusted clasp. The metal was corroded, pitted with age, but intact, heavy, something substantial inside. Thomas carried it back to the house, Scout trotting beside him with obvious satisfaction, as if he'd completed some important mission. In the kitchen, Thomas set the box on the table and stared at it. His hands trembled slightly. Just old age, he told himself. Low blood sugar. He should eat something. But he didn't move to make breakfast. He stood there, studying the box, feeling an inexplicable dread building in his chest. Finally, he worked the clasp open. It resisted, rust flaking away, then gave with a metallic snap. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly disintegrated, were letters. Dozens of them. Maybe 100. Stacked carefully, organized by date from what he could see. The envelopes were yellowed, some water-stained, but preserved well enough by the sealed tin. Thomas lifted the first one with shaking hands. The handwriting on the envelope was his mother's. He'd know it anywhere. Careful, elegant script she'd learned in finishing school before the Depression had ended such luxuries. The letter was addressed to someone named Joseph Greeley, Pinewood State Hospital. Thomas stared at the name. Joseph Greeley. He didn't know anyone named Joseph Greeley. The envelope had never been mailed. No postage, no postmark. Just the address written in his mother's hand, the letter sealed inside. With careful fingers, Thomas opened it. The paper inside was thin, delicate. Dated April 1960. My dearest Joseph, it began. Thomas read slowly, his mind struggling to process the words. The letter spoke of missing someone, of hoping they were well cared for, of regret and love and unbearable sorrow. His mother wrote about the weather, about the farm, about small daily things. Then, near the end, your brother Thomas asked about you again yesterday. I told him you were away, staying with relatives. He doesn't understand why you can't come home. I wish I could explain it to him, but he's too young to understand. I wish I understood it myself. Thomas read the final line 3 times. Your brother Thomas. The letter slipped from his fingers and drifted to the table. Brother. He had a brother. Someone named Joseph. That was impossible. He was an only child, had always been an only child. His parents had only ever had him. There had never been anyone else. He picked up another envelope. Same handwriting, different date. May 1960. Then another. June, July. He opened them randomly, hands moving faster now, desperate to understand. Each letter was addressed to Joseph, each one written by his mother but never sent. They spoke of hospital visits, of doctors' reports, of medications and treatments. They mentioned Thomas by name. Thomas is doing well in school. Thomas caught his first fish yesterday. Thomas misses you, even though he doesn't remember why. Thomas felt the room tilting. He gripped the edge of the table. Doesn't remember why. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Think. Remember. But there was nothing. No memory of a brother. No memory of anyone named Joseph. His childhood in this house had been solitary. Just him, his parents, and the endless work of the farm. He'd played alone, eaten meals at a table set for 3, slept in a room by himself. Hadn't he? Thomas closed his eyes, reaching back into memory. Age 8, 9, 10. What did he remember? His father's silence, his mother's sadness. Long afternoons when he'd been sent to stay with neighbors for no clear reason. Closed doors and hushed conversations. The feeling always that something was wrong in the house. Something unspoken that pressed down on everything like humid air before a storm. But no brother. No Joseph. He opened his eyes and looked at the pile of letters. Evidence. Undeniable. His mother had written these. She'd written about a son named Joseph, about Thomas's brother, about hospital visits, and a child who couldn't come home. Thomas picked up another letter, this one from 1961. His mother's handwriting was less steady, the words more desperate. She wrote about Joseph having seizures, about him not recognizing her during the last visit, about the doctors saying there was nothing more they could do. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the letters, Thomas found something wrapped in a piece of soft cloth. He unfolded it carefully. A wooden toy horse, hand-carved, simple but beautifully made. On its base, someone had carved initials. J.G., Joseph Greeley. Thomas held the toy in his palm. It was small, made for a child's hand, worn smooth in places where it had been held, played with, loved. He had a brother. Somehow, impossibly, he'd had a brother, and that brother had been taken away, institutionalized, written to but never visited by Thomas himself, and Thomas had no memory of it. No memory of him. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, dust motes dancing in the light. Scout lay at his feet, head on his paws, watching Thomas with concerned eyes. "I had a brother," Thomas whispered to the empty room. The words felt foreign on his tongue, true and impossible at the same time. He looked at the letters scattered across the table, at the toy horse in his hand, at the evidence of a life he'd somehow forgotten. What else didn't he remember? What else had been hidden from him, or erased, or buried like this box beneath the rotting shed? Thomas sat down heavily, still clutching the wooden horse, and began to read his mother's letters from the beginning, searching for answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The letters lay spread across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known was incomplete. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that name, Joseph Greeley, his brother. A person who should have been part of his life, part of his memories, part of who he was. But there was nothing, just absence where something vital should have been. He made coffee as the first grey light of dawn crept through the windows. His hands shook as he poured, hot liquid splashing onto the counter. Scout watched him from the doorway, sensing his agitation, but not understanding it. Thomas had organized the letters chronologically during the long night. The earliest was dated January 1958, when Thomas would have been 8 years old. He picked it up now and read it again, trying to find some foothold in memory. "My precious Joseph," his mother had written, "you came into this world 3 days ago, and already my heart is so full I fear it might break. Your brother Thomas held you yesterday and said you were the best present he'd ever received. He's promised to teach you everything he knows when you're old enough. He doesn't understand yet how much care you'll need, but his intentions are pure and good." Thomas set the letter down carefully, as if it might crumble to dust. He'd been there, 8 years old, holding a baby brother, making promises, and he remembered none of it. The next several letters chronicled Joseph's infancy. His mother wrote about sleepless nights, about feeding difficulties, about a baby who cried more than seemed normal. Then, a letter from June 1958. "Dr. Patterson says Joseph's development is delayed. He can't say why yet, only that we should watch carefully and bring him back in 3 months. Thomas reached for the wooden toy horse. It sat in the center of the table, a small anchor of reality. He turned it over in his hands, studying the careful carving, the worn spots where small fingers had gripped it over and over. Someone had made this with love. For Joseph, his brother. The letters continued through 1958 and into 1959. Joseph wasn't walking when he should have been, wasn't speaking, had trouble eating solid foods. His mother's worry grew with each letter. the handwriting becoming less controlled, the words more desperate. By late 1959, the letters mentioned Thomas more frequently. Thomas tries to play with Joseph, but the baby only cries. Yesterday, Joseph knocked over Thomas's tower of blocks, and Thomas got so upset. I had to explain again that Joseph doesn't mean to cause trouble, that he can't help it. Thomas said he understood, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. Thomas stood and walked to the window. Outside, the farm lay quiet in the early morning. A rabbit hopped across the overgrown garden. Somewhere, a crow called. He tried to remember being 9 years old, tried to picture another child in the house, a baby who cried, who needed constant attention, who disrupted his games. There was something, a fragment, a feeling more than a memory, of being told to be quiet, of tiptoeing past a closed door, of his mother's face lined with exhaustion, her finger to her lips. "Shh, Thomas, your brother is finally sleeping." Had that happened, or was his mind creating false memories from the letters, filling in blanks that should have stayed empty? He returned to the table and picked up a letter from March 1960. This one was different, longer. His mother's handwriting was unsteady, words crossed out and rewritten. "They tell me it's for the best," she wrote. "Dr. Patterson says Joseph needs specialized care we can't provide at home. The seizures are getting worse. Last week he had one that lasted nearly 10 minutes, and I was sure, that I was going to lose him right there in his crib. Thomas saw it happen. He was so frightened. He won't go near Joseph's room anymore." Thomas's throat tightened. He forced himself to keep reading. "Your father says we have no choice. The hospital in Pinewood has doctors who understand these conditions. They can help Joseph in ways we can't. But how can I send my baby away? How can I put him in the hands of strangers? Thomas keeps asking when Joseph is coming home, and I don't know how to tell him that he's not, that he might never come home." The letter was stained, the ink smudged in places. Tears, Thomas realized. His mother had cried while writing this. He found a water-stained envelope near the bottom of one stack. Inside was a hospital document, folded small. Thomas opened it carefully. It was an invoice from Pinewood State Hospital, dated April 1960, for patient admission and initial evaluation. The patient's name, Joseph Andrew Greeley. Age 2 years. Clipped to it was another document, a receipt for payment in full. His father had paid, had sent the boy away, had made the decision that would fracture their family in ways Thomas was only beginning to understand. He thought about his father, that stern man who'd worked the farm from dawn to dusk, who'd rarely smiled, who'd seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Thomas had never understood the source of that heaviness, had assumed it was just the hardship of farm life, the endless struggle to make a living from stubborn soil. Now he wondered if his father had been carrying something else entirely, the weight of a choice, the burden of a son sent away. Thomas picked up the next letter, dated May 1960. His mother described her first visit to Pinewood. The long drive, the institutional smell of the place. Joseph in a room with 3 other children, none of them speaking, one of them rocking constantly in the corner. "He didn't know me," she wrote. "I held him and he screamed. The nurse said it would take time, that children adjust. But how can a baby adjust to losing his mother? How can I adjust to this?" The letters from the following months were shorter. His mother visited monthly, sometimes twice a month. She wrote about Joseph's condition stabilizing, about medications that helped with the seizures, about small moments of what might have been recognition or might have been wishful thinking. And gradually, Thomas disappeared from the letters. No more mentions of your brother Thomas. It was as if his mother had decided to separate her two sons completely, one in the hospital, one at home, and never the two together in her mind or on the page. Thomas found the cloth wrapping that had protected the toy horse. It was soft, worn thin in places. He spread it out on the table. Embroidered in one corner, faded but still visible, were the initials J.A.G., Joseph Andrew Greeley. His brother had a middle name, a full name, a whole identity that Thomas had never known about. Scout whined softly and pressed against Thomas's leg. The dog knew something was wrong, could sense the grief emanating from his owner like heat from a stove. "I had a brother," Thomas said aloud, testing the words again. "His name was Joseph Andrew Greeley. He was my brother, and I forgot him." But had he forgotten, or had he been made to forget? The letters suggested he'd known, at least for the first 2 years of Joseph's life. He'd held him, played with him, been frightened by his seizures. Then what? What had happened to erase all of that from his memory? Thomas looked at the remaining stacks of letters. There were still so many to read. Years of his mother's one-sided correspondence with a son who probably never saw these words, never knew his mother was pouring her heart out onto paper each month. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the kitchen window, making the dust motes dance. A new day. The farm waiting outside. But Thomas couldn't leave this table, couldn't stop reading, couldn't rest until he understood. He picked up the next letter, dated June 1960, and continued his journey into a past he should have remembered, but didn't. By the second day, Thomas had read through 3 years of letters. His mother had been methodical, writing at least once a month, sometimes more. Each letter addressed to Joseph, each one never sent. They'd been meant for no one's eyes, he realized, just his mother's way of processing grief too heavy to carry alone. The letters from 1960 and 1961 painted a picture of a family coming apart at the seams. Joseph's condition worsened despite the hospital's care. The seizures continued. He developed pneumonia twice. He stopped making eye contact entirely, retreating into whatever silent world his damaged brain had created for him. And at home, Thomas, young Thomas, the boy he'd been, had started to forget. His mother wrote about it in a letter from September 1960. "Thomas asked me today who lived in the room next to his. I told him it was storage now, that we'd moved things around. He accepted this without question. I don't know if he's truly forgetting Joseph or if he's trying to protect himself from the pain. Either way, I'm losing both my sons." Thomas set the letter down and rubbed his eyes. They burned from lack of sleep and too much reading. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't bother making more. He tried again to remember, closed his eyes, and reached back to age 10, 11. What had been in that room next to his? He'd always thought of it as storage, hadn't he? A place for old furniture and boxes of his mother's things. But maybe once it had been something else. The fragment of a memory. Blue curtains. A mobile hanging over a crib. Wooden animals spinning slowly. The sound of crying that went on and on. Or was he imagining it? Creating false memories from the letters, his mind trying to fill in the gaps? Scout nudged his hand with a wet nose. Thomas absently scratched behind the dog's ears, grateful for the simple, uncomplicated presence. He picked up another letter, this one from November 1960. Something was paper-clipped to it, a yellowed invoice from Cedar Ridge County Hospital. Thomas unfolded it carefully. Extended psychiatric evaluation, minor child, the description read. The amount charged was substantial, especially for 1960. At the bottom, stamped in red ink, paid in full. Thomas stared at the words. Psychiatric evaluation. They'd taken Joseph to psychiatrists. Back then, in rural Iowa, that would have been almost unthinkable. The stigma alone would have been crushing. His mother's letter, attached to the invoice, explained. Dr. Patterson referred us to a specialist in Cedar Ridge. They kept Joseph for 5 days, running tests. The diagnosis is something called childhood schizophrenia with developmental delays and seizure disorder. The words mean nothing to me. The doctor said Joseph will never be normal, never be able to live independently, never be able to communicate in any meaningful way. He recommended permanent institutionalization. The next paragraph was heavily blotted, words almost illegible. Your father says we have to accept it, that we've done everything we can, that we have Thomas to think about, and this isn't fair to him. I screamed at him. I broke a plate against the wall. Thomas heard everything. I found him hiding in the barn afterward, crying. What have we become? Thomas felt tears on his own cheeks. He wiped them away impatiently. He was crying for a brother he didn't remember, for parents whose pain he'd never understood, for a version of himself who'd witnessed things no child should witness. The letters from 1961 showed his mother's slow resignation. She still visited Joseph monthly, but the visits were shorter. The boy didn't respond to her presence. Sometimes he seemed agitated by it, crying until she left. The nurses say he's better when I'm not there, she wrote in March 1961. That my visits disturb his routine. They suggest I come less frequently. But if I stop visiting, who will he have? Who will remember that he was loved once, that he was wanted? Thomas found another letter from that same month, this one darker in tone. Thomas got hurt today. He fell from the hayloft, or that's what he says, but I found bruises on his arms that don't match a fall. When I pressed him, he finally admitted that some boys from school cornered him, asked about Joseph. Someone had heard about the institutionalization. Small towns talk. They called Joseph a retard, called our family crazy. Thomas fought them and lost. Thomas touched his left shoulder unconsciously. He had a scar there, a thin white line he'd always told people came from a farming accident. But now, reading his mother's words, he wondered. Had that been from the fight? Had he carried evidence of his brother's existence on his skin all these years without knowing it? The letters from late 1961 and 1962 showed a shift. His mother wrote less about the visits and more about daily life on the farm, about Thomas's progress in school, about the crops and weather, about anything except the truth of their fractured family. And then, in a letter from April 1962, she wrote, I think Thomas has forgotten completely now. He mentioned yesterday that he wishes he had a brother, someone to help with chores and play baseball with. I said nothing. Your father caught my eye across the table and shook his head slightly. We've agreed, without words, to let Thomas have this ignorance. It seems kinder than the truth. Kinder. They'd thought forgetting was kinder. Thomas stood and paced the kitchen, his body stiff from sitting too long. The morning had turned to afternoon without him noticing. Scout's water bowl was empty. He filled it, then stood at the sink, staring out at the overgrown farm. How many times had his mother stood in this exact spot, looking out this same window, carrying secrets that were eating her alive? How many dinners had she prepared at this stove, setting 3 plates instead of 4, pretending everything was normal? He returned to the table and picked up the toy horse again. Someone had made this for Joseph. His father, probably. Thomas remembered his father working in the workshop on winter evenings, carving things from scrap wood. He'd made Thomas toys, too, a truck, A train, a set of blocks. Had his father made this horse during those same evenings? Had young Thomas watched him carve it, not knowing it was for a brother who was slowly disappearing from his life and memory? The next stack of letters covered 1963 through 1969. They were thinner, shorter. His mother's monthly reports on Joseph's condition, which remained unchanged. She described him growing physically. By 1965, he was 7 years old and the size of a 5-year-old. He never spoke, never made eye contact, spent his days in repetitive motions, rocking or flapping his hands. And at home, Thomas, teenage Thomas now, was thriving. His mother wrote about his good grades, his friends, his plans to attend college. She wrote about his normalcy with something that felt like relief and guilt in equal measure. Thomas is becoming a man, she wrote in 1968, when Thomas was 18. He's been accepted to the university in Des Moines. He'll study engineering. I'm so proud of him and so heartbroken, because he's leaving, and he's taking with him the last piece of normalcy in this house. When he's gone, it will just be us and the empty room and the secret we keep. Your father says I should stop visiting you, that it's been 8 years and you don't know me anyway. But I can't. Even if you don't remember, I do. I'm still your mother. That doesn't change just because you can't recognize me. Thomas sat back down heavily. His mother had carried this burden alone for years. His father had been there physically, but emotionally he'd checked out, had made the practical choice to move on. But his mother never did. She kept writing letters to a son who couldn't read them, kept visiting a boy who didn't know her face, kept loving someone who'd been lost to her years before. The sun was setting outside. Thomas had been reading for nearly 2 full days with only brief breaks for sleep. His eyes ached, his back hurt, but he couldn't stop, because somewhere in these remaining letters was the end of Joseph's story, and he needed to know how it ended, this tale of a brother he should have remembered, but didn't. Thomas slept fitfully that night, dreams filled with fragments that might have been memories, or might have been his mind's attempt to create what the letters described. A child crying, blue curtains, his mother's face, younger, streaked with tears, a wooden mobile spinning above a crib. He woke before dawn, disoriented, Scout pressed against his side on the narrow bed. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was. Then it came back, the farmhouse, the letters, Joseph, his brother. The words still felt strange, foreign, like a language he'd once spoken but forgotten. He made coffee and returned to the kitchen table where the letters waited. The stacks from the 1960s were neatly organized now, read and processed. What remained were letters from the 1970s, fewer of them, the envelopes yellowed and brittle with age. Thomas picked up the first letter from 1970. His mother's handwriting had changed, grown shakier, less controlled. She would have been in her late 50s then, aged beyond her years by grief and secrets. "Dearest Joseph," she wrote, "I visited you yesterday. You're 12 now, though you don't look it. Still small for your age, still silent. I sat with you for an hour in the day room. You rocked back and forth the entire time, staring at the wall. A nurse told me you'd do that for hours each day. I wanted to hold you, to tell you I'm sorry, but I know it would only upset you. So I just sat nearby and talked about nothing. The weather, the farm, your father's health, which isn't good, though he won't admit it." Thomas stopped reading. His father's health. He'd died in 1973, but Thomas hadn't known he'd been sick before that. The death had seemed sudden, a heart attack while working in the field. Thomas had come home for the funeral, spent 3 days helping his mother with arrangements, then returned to his life in the city. He'd been 23, newly married to Margaret, working his first real job. Too young, he'd thought then, to lose his father. Now, reading his mother's words, he realized how little he'd actually known about the man. The next letter, from May 1970, mentioned his father more explicitly. "Your father had another episode last night. Chest pains. He refuses to see a doctor. Says we can't afford it with the hospital bills for you. I told him we'd find a way, but he just shook his head and went to bed. Sometimes I think he wants to die. That he's tired of carrying this weight. I can't blame him. Hospital bills for Joseph." Thomas had never considered the financial burden. Pinewood State Hospital wasn't free. Someone had been paying for Joseph's care all those years, keeping him in that place while the farm struggled. His father had died in debt. Thomas knew that much. After the funeral, his mother had told him the farm was mortgaged to the limit. Thomas had helped pay it off over the next few years, sending money monthly while his mother lived alone in the farmhouse. He'd thought it was just farm expenses, the cost of maintaining the land. Now he understood. The debt had been Joseph. Thomas continued reading. Letters from 1971 and 1972 were sparse, just a few per year. His mother wrote about Joseph's health remaining stable, about her visits becoming less frequent because the drive was difficult and expensive. Then, a letter from January 1973, 2 months before his father's death. "I haven't visited you in 4 months, my darling boy. I'm ashamed to admit it. The truth is I can't bear it anymore. You're 14 years old and you don't know me. You never will. The doctors say your condition is permanent, that there's no treatment, no hope of improvement. They say you're comfortable, that you don't suffer. But how can they know? You can't tell them. You can't tell anyone." The letter continued. "Your father collapsed in the barn yesterday. I found him 20 minutes later. He was conscious, but his lips were blue. I called for the ambulance, but by the time they arrived, he was insisting he was fine, just tired. He made me promise not to tell Thomas. The boy has his own life now, he said. No need to burden him with an old man's problems. As if you weren't already a burden we'd chosen not to share." Thomas set the letter down, his hands shaking. His father had been dying, had known he was dying, and had kept it from Thomas, just as he'd kept Joseph's existence secret. The pattern was clear now. His father's way of protecting was through silence, through hiding difficult truths, through letting people live in ignorance rather than pain. Had it been protection, or had it been cowardice? Thomas didn't know, wasn't sure he could judge. He thought about his own children, Peter and Grace, and the walls he'd built around his emotions after Margaret died. Maybe silence ran in the family like blue eyes, or a tendency toward bad knees. The next letter was dated March 1973, written just days before his father's death. "Your father is gone, Joseph. Heart attack in the field, just like Kita. Always said he'd go, working until the end. Thomas came for the funeral. He looks so much like his father now, stern and closed off. He asked practical questions about the farm, about debts, about what I need. But he didn't ask about anything that matters. Didn't ask if I was all right, if his father and I were happy, if there was anything left unsaid. I suppose I taught him that. How to avoid the hard questions. How to keep moving forward without looking back. Thomas felt those words like a physical blow. He remembered that funeral, remembered being efficient and practical, handling arrangements while his mother sat silent and dry-eyed. He'd thought he was being strong for her. Now he saw it differently. He'd been distant, emotionally unavailable, just like his father. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree," Margaret used to say, when she'd noticed him withdrawing during difficult conversations. She'd meant it affectionately, teasing, but there was truth in it. He'd learned from his father how to bury feelings, how to focus on tasks instead of emotions, how to build walls that kept pain out but also kept connection at bay. And his children had learned the same from him. Thomas stood and walked to the window. The sun was rising, painting the overgrown fields in shades of gold and amber. Scout followed and sat beside him, leaning against his leg. "I'm just like him," Thomas said quietly. "Just like my father. Keeping secrets, keeping distance, thinking it protects people when all it does is push them away." He thought about Peter and Grace, about the gap between them that had seemed natural and inevitable. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a pattern, a learned behavior passed down like furniture or land. Thomas returned to the table and picked up the next letter. It was dated April 1973, just weeks after his father's funeral. His mother's handwriting was barely legible, the words wandering across the page. "I went to see you today, Joseph. First time in 6 months. I told myself I needed to see you, to tell you that your father is gone. But you wouldn't understand. You didn't even look at me when I sat down, just kept rocking, back and forth, in that same rhythm you've had for years. I stayed 10 minutes. That's all I could manage." The letter continued. "I thought about telling Thomas about you at the funeral. Almost did. Twice. But what would be the point? He's building his own life. Why burden him with this? Why make him carry what we carried? Let him have his ignorance. Let at least one of us be free." Thomas closed his eyes. His mother had made the same choice his father had. Silence over truth. Protection through ignorance. They'd both decided he was better off not knowing. And maybe they'd been right. What would it have changed if he'd known? Would he have visited Joseph? Would it have helped anything? Or just added more weight to an already heavy burden? But looking at the letters spread across the table, at the evidence of his brother's existence carefully preserved and buried, Thomas thought maybe the point wasn't about changing anything. Maybe the point was simply knowing, remembering, acknowledging that Joseph had existed, had mattered, had been loved despite everything. The remaining letters in the pile looked thinner, fewer. Thomas picked up the next one, dated 1974, and continued reading. The letters from 1974 were brief, clinical. His mother's monthly reports on Joseph's condition read like medical charts rather than letters from a mother to her son. Temperature normal. Eating adequately. No significant changes. The warmth that had characterized her earlier letters was gone, replaced by a weary factualness that made Thomas's chest ache. In October 1974, she wrote, "You turned 16 today, Joseph. The nurses say you weigh 92 pounds, that you're healthy despite everything. They say you could live for decades like this, rocking, staring, silent. Decades. The word makes me want to scream. Is this living? Is this what I fought so hard to preserve when you were small, and the doctors said you might not survive?" Thomas paused, looking at the date. October 1974. He would have been 24 then, married to Margaret for 2 years. They'd been trying for their first child, he remembered. Margaret had been hopeful, talking about baby names, painting the spare bedroom yellow, because it would work for either a boy or girl. Peter was born the following spring, 1975. Thomas remembered his mother coming to visit in the hospital, remembered her holding the baby with tears in her eyes. He'd thought it was just grandmother sentiment, joy at her first grandchild. Now he wondered if she'd been thinking of Joseph, of another baby boy she'd held, one who'd never grown into the person he might have been. The next letter answered that question. Dated May 1975, written on what must have been one of her visits to the hospital. I held Thomas's son yesterday. Peter, a beautiful, healthy boy with all his fingers and toes and a cry that could wake the dead. Margaret let me feed him, and I sat there in their cheerful apartment with this perfect child in my arms, and all I could think about was you. About how different things might have been. About how unfair it is that some children get everything while others get nothing. The words were brutal in their honesty. Thomas had to read them twice, trying to reconcile this bitter, grieving woman with the mother he remembered. Gentle, resigned, quietly fading into the background of his life. But of course she'd been bitter. Of course she'd grieved. She'd lost a son while everyone around her celebrated new life, pretended that loss didn't exist. The letter continued. I'm a terrible person for thinking such things. Peter is innocent. He deserves every bit of joy and health he has. But standing there in that hospital nursery, I wanted to scream at all those happy parents. Do you know how lucky you are? Do you know how easily this could be taken from you? How fragile normal really is. Thomas set the letter down and pressed his palms against his eyes. His mother had stood in that nursery, had held Peter, had smiled and cooed and said all the appropriate grandmother things. And inside, she'd been breaking. Had his father known? Had they talked about it, shared the grief, or had they each carried it alone? The next letter was dated July 1975. The handwriting was shaky, words crossed out and rewritten. Joseph, my darling boy, I have to tell you something, though you'll never hear these words. You died 3 days ago. Pneumonia, they said. Your lungs were never strong. You were 23 years old. You never spoke a word in your life. Never knew your own name. Never knew mine. Thomas stopped breathing. The letter trembled in his hands. Joseph was dead. Had been dead for 50 years. They called me at 6 a.m, his mother wrote. A nurse with a kind voice, professional sympathy. They said you passed peacefully in your sleep, that you didn't suffer. How would they know? You couldn't tell them if you were suffering. You could never tell anyone anything. The next paragraph was heavily blotted, nearly illegible. I should feel relief. That's what everyone will expect when they find out. Relief that it's finally over, that the burden is lifted. And God help me, there is relief. But there's also this hole in my chest where my heart should be. Because you were my son. Difficult, damaged, impossible to reach. But mine. And now you're gone, and I never. The sentence ended there, unfinished. The rest of the page was blank, except for one line at the bottom. I'm burying these letters with you, my darling. All of them. Every word I never sent. So you'll finally know you were loved. But she hadn't buried them. She'd put them in the tin box and hidden them under the equipment shed. Why? Had she changed her mind? Had something stopped her? Thomas picked up the next letter with trembling hands. It was dated August 1975, a month after Joseph's death. I couldn't do it, his mother wrote. They cremated you. I couldn't afford a burial plot, and your father's grave is in the family cemetery where Thomas visits. I couldn't put you there, couldn't explain to him who you were after all these years of silence. So they gave me your ashes in a plain box, and I scattered them in the creek behind the farm. The water will carry you to the river, to the ocean eventually. You'll be everywhere and nowhere, just like you were in life. Thomas felt tears on his cheeks. He let them fall. I couldn't bury the letters, she continued. Couldn't let them go into the ground or burn with your ashes. They're all I have left of you, all I have left of the son I loved and failed in equal measure. So I'm keeping them, hiding them. Maybe someday someone will find them and know that you existed, that you mattered, that you were mourned. The remaining letters in the box were fewer now, years passing between them. His mother wrote to Joseph's memory, to the space he'd left behind. She wrote about watching Peter grow, about Grace being born in 1977, about Thomas building a good life in the city. Your brother is a good father, she wrote in 1980. Better than we were, I think. He's patient with his children, present in ways your father never was. Maybe because he doesn't carry our burden. Maybe ignorance really is bliss. Thomas thought about that assessment. Had he been a good father? Margaret had thought so, but his children might disagree. He'd been there physically, yes, but emotionally. He'd struggled with that, always had. The wall between what he felt and what he could express had seemed insurmountable. Maybe he'd been carrying a burden after all. Not the knowledge of Joseph, but the absence of him. The ghost of a brother he'd forgotten, but whose loss had shaped him anyway. The second-to-last letter was dated 1985. His mother described her health failing, her visits to doctors, the diagnosis she hadn't told Thomas about because he was busy with his own life. "I'm dying," she wrote simply. "Cancer. They give me 6 months, maybe a year. I should tell Thomas, but what's the point? He'll come, be dutiful, handle arrangements, just like he did when his father died. I've taught him well how to keep moving without feeling too much." The final letter was dated March 1989, just weeks before his mother's death. Thomas remembered getting the call from a neighbor, rushing to the hospital, arriving too late. She'd died alone while he was on the highway, driving too fast, trying to reach her in time. He picked up the last letter now with shaking hands. "My dearest Thomas," it began. Not Joseph. Thomas. This letter was for him, had always been meant for him. His mother had known, somehow, that he would find it eventually, that Scout would dig in the right place, that the box would be unearthed, that the truth would finally come out. Thomas began to read, his mother's final words to him, reaching across 35 years of silence. Thomas's hands shook as he held his mother's final letter. The handwriting was weak, wandering across the page, written by someone whose strength was nearly spent. He could picture her at this very table, pen gripping, trembling fingers, composing words she'd never say aloud. "My dearest Thomas," she'd written, "if you're reading this, then you've found what I buried. Part of me hoped you would. Part of me prayed you never would. I don't know which prayer God answered, but here we are." Thomas wiped his eyes and continued reading. "You had a brother named Joseph. By now you've read the letters. You know about his condition, his institutionalization, his death. You know that we kept him from you, that we let you forget. I won't apologize for that choice. We did what we thought was right, what we thought would protect you. Whether we were right or wrong, I'll never know." The letter continued for several paragraphs, his mother explaining her reasoning, her grief, her hope that he would understand. Thomas read it all, absorbing her perspective, feeling the weight of her love and her mistakes. Then, near the bottom of the second page, his mother wrote something that made the room tilt. "But there's more you need to know, Thomas. Something I couldn't write in the other letters because the shame was too great. Joseph wasn't born to us. Not in the way you think." Thomas's breath caught. He read the line again, making sure he understood. He was adopted, but not from strangers. Joseph was family. He was your cousin. The words blurred. Thomas blinked hard, forcing himself to focus. "Your father had a younger sister, Annie. You knew her, or you thought you did. We told you she died when you were young, in an accident." That was a lie. Annie didn't die until 1960, and it wasn't an accident. Thomas set the letter down, his mind reeling. Annie. He had vague memories of an aunt, a young woman with sad eyes who'd visited the farm occasionally when he was very small. He'd been told she died, though he couldn't remember being told exactly when or how. He picked up the letter again with trembling hands. Annie got pregnant in 1957. She was 19, unmarried. The father was a married man from town who wanted nothing to do with her once he found out. In those days, in this place, an unwed mother was ruined. The shame would have destroyed her, destroyed our whole family. Thomas thought about 1957, about small-town Iowa, about the rigid morality that could crush a young woman for a single mistake. "Your father and I made her a proposal. She would stay at the farm during her pregnancy, out of sight. When the baby came, we would adopt him legally and raise him as our own. The town would think I'd had another child. Annie would be free to leave, start over somewhere new without the stigma. So Joseph wasn't his brother. Not really. He was his cousin, born from scandal and desperation." Annie agreed. She had no choice, really. The pregnancy was difficult. She was sick most of the time, depressed. When Joseph was born in April 1958, we knew immediately something was wrong. He didn't cry like a healthy baby should. He struggled to breathe, to eat. But we went through with the adoption anyway. What else could we do? Thomas found he was gripping the table edge, knuckles white. His mother's words kept coming, relentless. For the first year, Annie stayed at the farm. She wanted to be near Joseph, to help care for him, even though legally he was ours. But it broke her heart every day, watching someone else mother her child, watching him struggle and knowing she'd brought him into a world of suffering. The next paragraph was heavily crossed out, then rewritten beneath. When Joseph's condition worsened, when the seizures started and the doctors gave their diagnosis, Annie blamed herself. She thought God was punishing her for her sin. No matter what we said, she believed she'd damaged him somehow, that her shame had poisoned him in the womb. Thomas felt sick. He stood and walked to the sink, splashed cold water on his face. Scout whined from his spot by the table, sensing distress. "I'm okay, boy," Thomas said, but his voice cracked on the words. He returned to the letter, forcing himself to continue. By late 1959, Annie couldn't bear it anymore. She left the farm, went to stay with cousins in Des Moines. We thought distance might help, that she could start building a life away from Joseph and the memories. But she kept coming back, showing up at the farm, asking to see him, crying when we said no because it upset you both. Thomas remembered something now, a woman coming to the house, his mother turning her away at the door, raised voices. He'd been hiding at the top of the stairs, listening. His father had said, "You can't keep doing this to yourself." And the woman had sobbed, "He's my son." He'd thought it was a neighbor, someone disturbed, nothing to do with him. But it had been Annie. It had been about Joseph. In March 1960, Annie came to the farm one last time, his mother wrote. Joseph had just been institutionalized the week before. Annie wanted to know where he was, wanted to visit him. Your father told her it would only make things harder. They argued. She said terrible things, that we'd stolen her baby, that we'd locked him away to hide our shame, that she should have kept him no matter what. The letter's handwriting deteriorated, becoming nearly illegible. 3 days later, They found her in Miller's Creek. She'd walked into the water and drowned herself. The sheriff called it an accident, said she must have slipped on the rocks. But we found a note in her room at her cousin's house. Just one line. I can't watch my son disappear anymore. Thomas sat down hard, the chair scraping against the floor. Annie had killed herself. Joseph's birth mother had drowned herself in grief and guilt. We buried her quietly, his mother wrote, told everyone, including you, that she'd died in an accident. Added another lie to all the others we were already telling. What was one more? But I've carried it, Thomas. For 30 years, I've carried the knowledge that we broke that girl, that our solution, our attempt to save everyone's reputation, destroyed her instead. At the bottom of the tin box, Thomas found what he'd missed before, a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He opened it with shaking fingers. Inside were legal documents, Joseph's birth certificate, listing Annie Greeley Holbrook as the mother, father unknown. The adoption papers, signed by Annie, by Thomas's parents, notarized and official. And a brief note in his father's handwriting, the only words from his father in the entire box. Annie's baby, born of shame but loved despite it. God forgive us for what we did to that girl. We thought we were helping. Maybe we were just protecting ourselves. Thomas laid the documents on the table beside his mother's letter. The whole picture was clear now. Not just a brother he'd forgotten, but a cousin. Not just an institutionalization, but an adoption. Not just a death, but a suicide driven by unbearable grief. Layer upon layer of secrets, each one built on the last, until the weight had crushed everyone involved. His mother's letter had one final paragraph. I'm telling you this now, Thomas, because I can't bear to take all these secrets to my grave. You deserve to know where you came from, what your family carried. Maybe you'll judge us. Maybe you'll hate us for the choices we made. Or maybe you'll understand that we were just people, doing the best we could with impossible situations. I pray it's the latter, but I'll never know. By the time you read this, I'll be long gone. I love you, son. I always did, even when I couldn't show it the way you needed. Your mother, always. Thomas sat in the silent kitchen as afternoon faded to evening, surrounded by the evidence of his family's tragedy. Joseph, Annie, his parents, all of them caught in a web of shame and silence that had destroyed them one by one. And him? Where did he fit in this story? The child protected through ignorance, raised without the burden of truth, free to build a normal life. But at what cost? Thomas sat motionless at the kitchen table long after the sun set, his mother's final letter still in his hands. The farmhouse creaked and settled around him, old wood contracting in the cooling evening air. Scout had given up trying to get his attention and lay curled by the door, occasionally lifting his head to check on his owner. The whole story was laid out now. Joseph, Annie, the adoption, the suicide, the decades of silence that had shaped his entire family. He thought about his children, Peter and Grace, both in their 40s, both living separate lives that barely intersected with his own. When had that distance started? Had it always been there, or had Margaret's death simply revealed what was already true? Thomas stood stiffly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting. He moved through the dark house to the stairs, climbed slowly to the second floor. The hallway stretched ahead of him, 3 doors visible in the dim light from the window at the end. His old room, his parents' room, and the third room, the one he'd always thought was storage. He stood in front of that third door for a long moment before pushing it open. The room was small, maybe 10 feet square. Boxes were stacked against one wall, old furniture covered with sheets. But there, in the corner, he could see the faint outline where a crib had once stood. The floorboards a slightly different color, protected from sunlight for years. Thomas knelt down slowly, running his hand over the spot. Here. Joseph had slept here, right next to Thomas's own room. They'd been brothers, or cousins, or whatever complicated thing their relationship had been, separated by a single wall. Had Thomas heard him crying at night? Had he heard the seizures, the distress, the sounds of a child who couldn't communicate his suffering? Maybe. Maybe those sounds had soaked into his young consciousness and been buried there, too painful to remember, too heavy for a child to carry. He stood and returned downstairs. In the kitchen, he gathered the letters carefully, organizing them back into chronological order. The photographs, the toy horse, Annie's documents, his mother's final confession, all the pieces of a story that had shaped 3 generations. Thomas knew what he had to do. The knowledge had been building since he'd read his mother's last letter, and now it crystallized into certainty. He couldn't keep this buried. Couldn't let another generation grow up in ignorance, shaped by secrets they didn't know existed. He had to tell Peter and Grace. The thought terrified him. They barely spoke to him as it was. What would they think when he told them about Joseph, about Annie, about the web of lies and shame their grandparents had woven? Would they understand? Would they care? Or would they see it as just more proof that their father's family was broken, that the emotional distance he'd maintained their whole lives had roots deeper than they'd known? Thomas sat down and pulled a pad of paper toward him. The same kind of lined paper his mother had used for grocery lists, for farm records, for the mundane details of daily life. He uncapped a pen and stared at the blank page. How did you begin a letter like this? How did you explain something you'd only just learned yourself? He started writing. Dear Peter and Grace, I'm writing to you from the old family farm, the one I haven't visited in 50 years. I came here to be alone, to spend my final years in peace. What I found instead was the truth about our family, truths that were buried long before you were born. His hand shook slightly as he wrote. He paused, took a breath, continued. I had a brother. His name was Joseph Andrew Greeley. He died in 1975, the same year Peter was born. You never knew about him because I never knew about him. Our family kept secrets, passed down silence like some people pass down china or land. Thomas wrote for an hour, maybe more. He told them everything, Joseph's condition, the institutionalization, Annie's story, the adoption, the suicide. He explained how he'd found the letters, how he'd spent days reading through his mother's grief and his father's terse admissions. I'm telling you this now, he wrote, because I've realized something. The silence in our family didn't start with me. I learned it from my father, who learned it from his own pain and shame. We thought we were protecting each other by not talking about difficult things, by keeping our grief private, by moving forward without looking back. But all we did was pass the pain down, generation to generation, until none of us knew how to connect anymore. He paused, thinking about Margaret. She'd tried to bridge that gap, had worked to maintain connections between him and the children. Without her, the fragile threads had snapped. When your mother died, I didn't know how to reach out to you, he continued. Didn't know how to share my grief or ask about yours. I thought being strong meant being silent. I was wrong. I see that now. Thomas looked up from the letter, his vision blurring with tears. Scout had moved closer, head resting on Thomas's foot. "I don't expect you to forgive me for the distance between us," he wrote. "I don't expect you to understand all of this immediately. But I need you to know the truth. I need you to know that our family struggles with connection, with openness, with love. They didn't start with me being a bad father. They started with impossible choices and unbearable grief that no one knew how to process." He wrote about finding the farm, about the quiet he'd sought and the chaos he'd found instead. He wrote about sitting at the kitchen table where his mother had written letters to a son who couldn't read them, where his father had eaten silent meals, carrying burdens no one else could see. "I'm 75 years old," Thomas wrote. "I don't know how much time I have left. But whatever time it is, I want to spend it differently. I want to be honest with you. I want you to know me, really know me. And I want to know you, not as the children I raised, but as the people you've become." He paused, pen hovering over the paper. This next part was the hardest. "I know I hurt you both by withdrawing after your mother died. I know I wasn't the father you needed, even when she was alive. I was there, but not really present, not emotionally available the way she was. I'm sorry for that. I can't change the past, but I can try to do better with whatever future we have." Thomas signed the letter, dated it, and read through it one more time. His handwriting was shaky in places, emotion evident in the uneven lines, but the words were honest. More honest than he'd been with his children in years, maybe ever. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. Tomorrow he'd drive to town and mail it. Then he'd wait and see if they responded, if they cared, if the truth could build a bridge where silence had created only chasms. It was late now, past midnight. Scout needed to go out. Thomas stood and walked with the dog into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way visible in a way it never was in the city. Somewhere out there, in the creek behind the property, were Annie's ashes, scattered by his mother's grieving hands. Somewhere in memory and earth and time were Joseph's 23 years of silent existence. Thomas thought about his mother's words. "Maybe someday someone will find them and know that you existed, that you mattered, that you were mourned." He'd found them. He knew now. And he would make sure Joseph and Annie weren't forgotten, that their stories were told, that the next generation understood where they came from. Standing in the darkness with Scout beside him, Thomas made a promise to the ghosts of his past. He would break the cycle of silence. Whatever it cost him, whatever response he got from Peter and Grace, he would tell the truth. It was time. Thomas drove to town the next morning, the letter to his children on the passenger seat beside him. The small post office sat on Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store and a diner that had been there since the 1950s. He'd bought stamps from the same building as a boy, mailing letters to his grandmother in Nebraska. The woman behind the counter was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a friendly smile. "Just the one?" she asked, weighing the envelope. "Just the one," Thomas confirmed, though it felt like he was mailing so much more than paper and ink. She gave him the total, applied the stamps, and dropped the letter into the bin behind her. Thomas watched it disappear, felt his stomach clench. No taking it back now. The truth was on its way to Peter and Grace, would arrive in their mailboxes in a few days, would change everything or nothing depending on how they chose to respond. He drove back to the farm slowly, the autumn landscape rolling past his window. Corn stubble in harvested fields, trees beginning to turn color at the edges, the world moving through its seasons while he sat suspended between past and future, waiting At home, Scout greeted him at the door with typical enthusiasm. Thomas fed him, made coffee, then stood in the kitchen, looking at the letters still spread across the table. He'd read them all now, absorbed the whole tragic story. But somehow he couldn't bring himself to pack them away. Instead, he found himself climbing the stairs to the attic. He'd been up here once since returning, just a brief look to check for leaks or structural damage. Now he moved more deliberately, searching for something specific. The attic was crammed with decades of accumulated belongings, furniture his parents had replaced but couldn't bring themselves to throw away. Boxes of old clothes, tools that no longer worked, and in the far corner, beneath a tarp, a small trunk. Thomas pulled it into the light. The label on the side read, A.H. in faded ink, Annie Holbrook. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were the remnants of a young woman's life. Clothes from the late 1950s, a blue dress with white polka dots, a cardigan with pearl buttons, costume jewelry, the kind a teenager might wear, a small collection of books, romance novels and poetry, and at the bottom, a leather-bound diary. Thomas lifted it carefully. The leather was soft, well worn. He opened to the first page. Property of Annie Holbrook, 1957, was written in looping script. He carried the diary downstairs, made fresh coffee, and sat at the table. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes in the air. Scout settled at his feet with a sigh. Thomas began to read. The early entries were typical of a young woman. Complaints about her strict parents, excitement about dances in town, descriptions of boys she found handsome. Annie had been vivacious, hopeful, full of life and dreams. Then an entry from June 1957. I met someone. Can't write his name, can't tell anyone. He's older, sophisticated. Makes me feel special in a way I've never felt before. We met behind the church after the social. He said I was beautiful. He said he couldn't stop thinking about me. Thomas felt a chill. He knew how this story ended. The entries over the following months documented a secret relationship, meetings behind buildings, stolen hours when the man could get away. Annie wrote about feeling guilty but also alive, loved, important. In November 1957, the tone shifted. I'm late, 2 weeks now. I'm terrified. What if I'm pregnant? He'll leave his wife, won't he? He said he loves me. He said he'd do anything for me. December. I told him today. He was angry. Said I was careless, that I should have been more careful. When I mentioned his wife, he laughed. Actually laughed. Said did I really think he'd leave her? That I was just a bit of fun? Nothing serious. I wanted to die right there. Thomas set the diary down, his chest tight. Annie had been 19, naive, taken advantage of by a married man who'd never intended to stand by her. January 1958. I told my brother today. Thought he might kill me. He turned so red, I've never seen him that angry. But then his wife touched his arm and something changed. They talked privately for a long time. When they came back, they had a plan. I'll stay here. They'll adopt the baby. No one will know. I'll be able to start over. Thomas thought about his father's rage, his mother's intervention. They'd been trying to save Annie, trying to save the family from scandal. Had it been kindness or self-preservation? Probably both. The pregnancy entries were filled with misery. Annie was sick, depressed, isolated on the farm away from her friends. She wrote about feeling the baby move and being overwhelmed with love and dread in equal measure. April 1958. He's here, my son. They won't let me hold him much, say it will make it harder. But I snuck into his room last night and just watched him sleep. He's so small, so perfect. How can I give him up? But the next entries revealed Joseph's struggles. The feeding problems, the failure to meet developmental milestones, Annie's growing conviction that something was wrong. September 1958. The doctors say he's delayed. They use words I don't understand. Neurological, developmental disorder. My brother says they're just being cautious, that babies develop at different rates. But I know, mothers know. Something is wrong with my baby, and it's my fault. Thomas read faster now, watching Annie's descent into guilt and despair. She blamed herself for Joseph's condition, convinced her sin had somehow damaged him. No amount of reassurance from doctors changed her mind. By 1959, the entries were dark, filled with self-recrimination. I ruined him. God is punishing me by punishing an innocent child. I deserve whatever happens to me, but he doesn't. He didn't ask to be born, didn't ask for a mother like me. The final entries, from early 1960, were almost illegible, the handwriting deteriorating as Annie's mental state collapsed. She wrote about not sleeping, about seeing Joseph's face everywhere, about not being able to bear the weight of what she'd done. March 15th, 1960. They took him away today, to some hospital where people will take care of him properly. I wasn't allowed to say goodbye. My brother says it's better this way, cleaner. But how can losing your child ever be clean? I'm so tired of fighting, of hurting, of living with this weight. March 18th, 1960. I can't do this anymore. I can't watch my son disappear into some institution while I'm supposed to go on living like nothing happened. Everyone says time will heal, that I'll move on. Maybe even get married someday and have other children. But they don't understand. I don't want other children. I want him. And since I can't have him, I don't want anything. That was the last entry. 3 days later, Annie had walked into Miller's Creek and not come out. Thomas closed the diary and sat in silence. The complete tragedy was clear now. Not just Joseph's suffering, but Annie's. A young woman destroyed by shame, by guilt she didn't deserve, by a world that offered her no good choices. He thought about his mother's final letter, her plea for understanding. They'd all been trying to survive an impossible situation, and they'd all been broken by it in different ways. Thomas stood and walked to the mantel where the old family photograph still sat. He looked at his father's stern face, his mother's careful smile, his own young, innocent expression. They'd all been carrying secrets, all been shaped by silence. But not anymore. Thomas had told his children the truth. Now he just had to wait and see if that truth could heal what silence had broken. The days that followed were strange, suspended. Thomas worked on the farm. Small repairs, clearing brush, fixing fence posts. Physical labor that kept his hands busy while his mind churned. Scout stayed close, seeming to sense his owner's unsettled state. He'd expected to feel relief after mailing the letter. Instead, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't anticipated. What had he done? Burdened his children with tragedies they'd had no part in. Exposed family shame that had been carefully buried for good reason. At night, he lay awake, wondering if they'd even read the letter. Peter might throw it away unopened. Grace might skim it and dismiss it as the ramblings of a lonely old man. Or worse, they might read it and judge him, judge all of them, for the choices made and secrets kept. On the 4th day after mailing the letter, Thomas decided to create something permanent, a memorial of sorts. He found the old family Bible on the mantel, right where it had always been. The leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed. He opened it carefully to the family record section. There, In careful script were the names and dates, marriages, births, deaths, his grandparents, his parents' wedding in 1947, his own birth in 1950, but nothing about Joseph, nothing about Annie, except a brief note of her birth in 1938. Thomas retrieved a pen and, with a steady hand, began to write. Joseph Andrew Greeley, born April 15, 1958, adopted son, died July 12, 1975, age 17, beloved brother and cousin. Below that, Annie Louise Greeley Holbrook, born March 3, 1938, died March 20, 1960, age 22, beloved sister and mother. He stared at the words. Official now. Part of the permanent record. No longer buried or forgotten. Between the pages of the Bible, he found pressed flowers, wild flowers his mother must have placed there years ago. Delicate, faded to pale shadows of their original colors, but preserved. Thomas walked outside, Scout trailing behind. Behind the house, past the overgrown garden, was the small family cemetery. 4 headstones stood there. His grandparents, his parents. The stones were weathered but legible. There was no marker for Joseph, no stone for Annie. Thomas knelt in the grass and pulled weeds from around his parents' graves. The work was meditative, giving his hand something to do while his thoughts wandered. I found them, Mother, he said quietly. Found the letters, found the whole story. I know about Joseph, about Annie, about all of it. The only response was the wind rustling through the tall grass. You asked me to understand. I'm trying. I think I do, mostly. You are all just trying to survive something impossible. But the silence. His voice caught. The silence hurt us all, didn't it? You, Father. Me. Even Peter and Grace, though they don't know it yet. He sat back on his heels, looking at the graves. 2 people who'd carried unbearable weight their entire adult lives, who'd made choices they thought were right, and paid the price in quiet suffering. I told them, Thomas continued, told Peter and Grace everything. I don't know if they'll respond, but I had to break the pattern. Had to try. He stood, joints protesting, and walked back to the house. In the kitchen, he gathered items. The old family photograph from the mantel, a picture he'd found in Annie's trunk showing her as a teenager, and a small photograph from the hospital, records showing Joseph as a young boy. Using a frame he found in the attic, Thomas arranged the 3 photographs together. The complete family, finally acknowledged. He hung the frame on the mantel, right in the center, where anyone entering the house would see it. There, he said to Scout. Everyone visible. Everyone counted. That afternoon, Thomas walked the property with fresh eyes. He found the spot where Annie's ashes had been scattered, Miller's Creek, running along the back of the property. The water was low this time of year, burbling over smooth stones. He gathered wildflowers from the field, the same kind his mother had pressed in the Bible. Queen Anne's lace, black-eyed Susans, purple asters. He waded into the shallow creek and released them into the current, watching them float downstream. I'm sorry, Annie, he said. Sorry for what happened to you. Sorry you carried that weight alone. Sorry Joseph's life was so hard. You both deserved better. The flowers drifted away, caught in the current, disappearing around the bend. Back at the house, Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not quite peace, but something close to it. Acceptance, maybe. Understanding that the past couldn't be changed, but it could be acknowledged, honored, remembered truthfully instead of buried in shame. He thought about Peter and Grace, about the letter making its way to them. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. He'd done what he could, told the truth, extended the invitation to connect. The rest was up to them. That evening, as the sun set over the fields, Thomas sat on the porch with the family Bible in his lap. He read through the names, the dates, the careful records of lives lived and lost. Now Joseph and Annie were part of that record, part of the family story, finally and forever. Scout lay beside him, head on his paws, content in the simple companionship. "Just us for now, boy," Thomas said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "But maybe not forever. Maybe they'll come. Maybe they'll want to know more, to understand where they came from." It was a hope, fragile but real, the first hope he'd felt in a long time. Inside the house, the framed photographs caught the last of the evening light. His parents, young Annie, small Joseph, and himself as a boy. All of them together at last, the complete and honest picture of the Greeley family. No more secrets, no more silence. Just truth, difficult and painful, but finally free. 2 weeks passed in quiet rhythm. Thomas rose with the sun, worked the land, read in the evenings, slept better than he had in years. The farm was beginning to show signs of care. The porch no longer sagged quite as much. The fence line stood straighter. The garden plot was cleared and turned for spring planting. He thought about Peter and Grace often, but tried not to obsess. They'd received the letter by now. Either they'd respond or they wouldn't. He couldn't control that. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, Thomas was replacing boards on the chicken coop when Scout started barking. The dog ran toward the driveway, tail wagging furiously. Thomas turned and saw a silver sedan pulling up to the house. His heart hammered. He didn't recognize the car, but when the door opened, he recognized the woman who stepped out. Grace. His daughter stood beside her car for a moment, looking at the farmhouse, at the fields, at him. She was 48 now, her dark hair showing threads of grey, her face lined in ways that made her look more like Margaret with each passing year. Thomas set down his hammer and walked toward her slowly, afraid if he moved too fast, she might startle and leave. "Hi, Dad," Grace said. Her voice was soft, uncertain. "Grace." His own voice came out rough. "You came. I got your letter." She held up an envelope. His letter, worn at the edges from being read multiple times. "I've read it about 20 times. I needed to see you, to see this place, to understand." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Scout circled Grace excitedly, and she knelt to pet him. "This must be Scout," she said. "Mum mentioned him in her last emails to me." The mention of Margaret hung between them for a moment. "Come inside," Thomas finally said. "I'll make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Thomas had read his mother's letters, where his parents had eaten silent meals, where generations of Greeleys had gathered. The framed photographs were visible on the mantel from where they sat. Grace cradled her coffee cup, studying the room. "It's smaller than I imagined. You never talked about this place." "No," Thomas agreed. "I didn't." "The letter," Grace began, then paused. "I had to read it 3 times before I believed it. You had a brother. Grandma and Grandpa adopted him. He died before I was born." "He died the year Peter was born," Thomas said. "Your grandmother held Peter in the hospital and thought about Joseph. I didn't know then, but I understand now." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Can I see the letters?" Thomas brought out the tin box. Grace went through the contents carefully. The letters, the photographs, Annie's diary, the legal documents. She read several of the letters completely, her eyes filling with tears. "This is heartbreaking," she whispered. "Poor Grandma, poor Annie. And Joseph, he never had a chance, did he?" "No," Thomas said. "He didn't." Grace set down a letter and looked at her father. "You didn't know about any of this?" "Truly? I have fragments of memory now, things that might be real or might be my mind trying to fill in gaps. But no, I didn't know. They made sure of that. And you think that's why? Grace paused, choosing words carefully. Why our family has always struggled with closeness, with communication? Thomas met her eyes. I think secrets and silence became our family's way of dealing with pain. My father learned it from his own pain. I learned it from him. And I'm afraid I taught it to you and your brother without meaning to. You did, Grace said, but her voice was gentle, not accusatory. After Mum died, you just shut down. We didn't know how to reach you. I didn't know how to let you in, Thomas admitted. I'd been practicing silence my whole life without knowing why. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Outside, leaves were beginning to fall from the old oak tree. Peter read the letter, too, Grace said. He called me. We talked for 3 hours, the longest conversation we've had in years. He's not ready to come here yet, but he wants to. Eventually. Hope bloomed in Thomas's chest. And you? Why did you come? Grace smiled, her eyes wet. Because I realized I didn't want to lose you the way Grandma lost Joseph. I didn't want to wake up one day and realize we'd run out of time for honesty. She reached across the table and took his hand. I want to know you, Dad. Really know you. Not the silent, distant version you showed us growing up, but the real person underneath all that. Thomas squeezed her hand, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it was thick with emotion. I'd like that. Very much. Tell me about the farm, Grace said. About growing up here. About the good memories, too. Not just the painful ones. And so Thomas talked. He told her about summers, swimming in Miller's Creek, about learning to drive the tractor at age 12, about his mother's garden and his father's workshop. He showed her the rooms upstairs, pointed out the spot where Joseph's crib had stood. They walked the property together, Scout bounding ahead. Thomas showed her the family cemetery, the new entries he'd made in the Bible. Grace stood at the graves for a long time, reading the names of grandparents she'd barely known. Can I stay a few days? She asked as they walked back to the house. Help you with the repairs? I took the week off work, told them it was a family emergency. Is it? Thomas asked. An emergency? Grace considered. No, it's the opposite. It's finally doing what we should have done years ago. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun set. Grace asked questions about his childhood, about Margaret, about his regrets and hopes. Thomas answered honestly, finding that the more he talked, the easier it became. I'm going to call Peter tonight, Grace said. Tell him about this place, about you. Maybe he'll come for Thanksgiving. I'd like that, Thomas said, quietly. As darkness fell, they went inside. Grace looked at the framed photographs on the mantel, the complete family finally visible. They're part of our story, she said. Joseph and Annie. We should remember them. Yes, Thomas agreed. We should. That night, Thomas lay in bed, listening to Grace moving around in the room next door, the room that had once been Joseph's. Instead of ghosts and grief, he felt something new. Connection. Hope. The possibility of healing. The farm was no longer a place he'd come to die quietly. It had become something else. A place of truth, of remembrance, of new beginnings built on honest foundations. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside, the farmhouse held 3 generations of stories, no longer buried, but finally, truthfully told. Thomas closed his eyes and slept peacefully for the first time in years, knowing that tomorrow his daughter would still be there, and that the silence that had defined his family for so long had finally, mercifully, been broken.